Good morning, fish keepers. Cam here from the fishroom.co.nz. Hope you're all well. We've made it to Friday. Let's do coffee. That's way stronger than normal. I had a wee issue with my coffee machine and I doubled it up. We'll get through it. Good times. All right. We've got ourselves a guest sitting in the background. So we'll bring on Bentley and we'll bring on John.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Cheers.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It is much appreciated.
Yeah, man. I'm looking forward to it. So it's always fun to get to interact with other people that I've kind of like been watching from afar a little bit here and there. I actually find like your day in the life of the fish store owner like really fun. So this should be a blast.
Cool. Awesome. Just so everybody is aware, Bentley doesn't have a gazillion hours, so whenever he needs to disappear, we'll be calling it a day then. So we might not get our normal time, but we'll get what we can get, and we'll take it while we can. So again, thank you very much for being with us. What first ignited your passion for aquariums and got you involved in wanting to do everything on YouTube as well?
Okay, so the long story done as short as possible. My family has kept fish for generations. So on my mom's side of the family, it goes back to my great grandmother. But we've had fish ever since I was a kid. Like there's a picture. I don't think I've put it on the internet yet, but like my uncle holding me as a little baby with my parents in the background, staring at like a 125 or 150 gallon fish tank that was in our front living room for a long time. So I've been into fish ever since I was little. I stopped keeping fish in college, mostly because they had a tank blow apart and I was too poor to afford a replacement, with me and my cousin living together. And then I got back into fish keeping in 2016, during a period of time when I was like, I finally became a homeowner, had space to have fish tanks again instead of like not having that space whatsoever. And YouTube, man, I was watching random stuff on YouTube, got suggested a video from a channel called The Green Machine, which sadly no longer exists, but was a fantastic channel in store for a while. And the cat, I'm sorry. We'll get interrupted by my dog at some point, I'm sure. But I watched a couple of videos from them and I was like, I miss having fish. And away we go. As far as like getting into YouTube, I did a few videos here and there, mostly as like personal documentation or like some contests of like small YouTube creators that I was watching that I really liked. And then eventually Fluval had this like bigger contest and it got me a little more interested. I just kept shooting small videos. But I guess like the real catalyst to become serious about creating content on YouTube, my friend Alex, so we probably all know him as Fishery, who's here on YouTube as well. He's a club member of mine and was like, hey, can I come over and like tour all your tanks? Cause you've got a bunch of crazy stuff. You're always bringing in all these plants. Can I come talk with you? And we sat down and talked for a while after we did the tour and the little interview. And I was just like, yeah, I'm just going to keep doing this. And from there on out, it was like a slow progression of moving away from, like shooting things on a terrible cell phone to actually trying to do things a little more clean and edited and focusing in on the things that I felt I could do well for YouTube that maybe weren't as well represented by other channels that were out there.
Sure. Makes sense. Very cool. How do you select your topics for your videos and what kind of, how does that process sort of roll through for you?
Sure. So, it's evolved over time for certain. Lately, and by lately, I mean, time meshes together for me at this point just because of the way that my work is and my life runs. What seems like within a reasonably short period of time is actually like a year and a half, and my brain just like gels it all together. You might call it old man syndrome or something. But I kind of do it half based on trends that I see in some of my own comments. So as I'm doing videos, if I see a trend in questions that I'm getting a lot, I'll make a video for it. If I have a concept of an idea, so like probably the most recent big series I did was like, your filter sucks, your filter is awesome. And it, the whole, I laugh at this now because I feel like the series was actually like a big success as far as putting information out, but like I was really short on time and I knew that I was working my brains out. I was working like, I think I had already put in 60 hours that week and I was only at like Wednesday. I was just working like crazy. And I knew I needed something I could shoot really fast. And I could do kind of off the cuff. I didn't have to like research very hard. And I was kind of wanted something to jazz some attention and like faux clickbaity title, in that it's not actually clickbait. The title is intentional. And so I was like, I'm just going to razz on sponge filters for a while because they're so well beloved in our hobby. And I'm just going to talk about all like the problems with sponge filters. And then I knew if I'm going to do that, I also have to do a video that's the positives. And then I just decided like people liked it enough. I'm just going to walk through most of the filtration methods that are out there. Not every, that would have taken me like 3.5 years, right? Because like, well, what happens if you have a sponge filter on an intake, but it's a reverse flow under gravel filter hooked to a canister with a, you can't do that kind of like Rube Goldbergian nonsense, right? But you can do like the basics, like an under gravel filter, a breeder box, a sump, a wet dry, etc. Right? Some of the big methods that are out there, and doing videos. And to this day, I still see random viewers that are like, "You're such an idiot! You don't know anything," especially on under gravel filters. That triggers people the most. It's really hilarious the number of like grandpas that are out there, and one of them is a member of my community who's I love him to death because he understands the point and is very sarcastic and is like, "Hey, grandpa here," like messing with me in the comments. It's a blast. But that was, some of them are spur of the moment like that, where I just come off the cuff, and then there are others where it's they harken back to things I've done for a while, whether it's talking about tips on plants or doing a lot of product oriented stuff, because I work in quality assurance for a living. So like my job is basically to break stuff. So often I take the way that I would do stuff in software and I apply those like testing standards to pieces of hardware that we use for fish tanks. And that leads to a lot of interesting stuff, because most people that do like a product review, they've had it for like a week. And I refuse to do a full review unless I've tested something for at least 3 months. And typically it's more like 6 months. I really want to put some paces on it, see how it acts over time, screw around with things, try to understand that stuff. It's the same stuff I do like in my working life, right? Is I can have a new product, but that doesn't mean that new product now is going to be the same 6 months from now. So you have to kind of continuously work at it and try to find its flaws or what's good about it, etc. So it's kind of like the things that I do the most. But I would say if you were looking at regular planning, I use it in Microsoft OneNote. It's just full of different ideas that I have. And a lot of it is scheduling conflicts, right? The biggest thing is like, I want to go tour X store or talk to XY person. And very frequently my schedule is usually the problem. My work schedule gets in the way very often. So like I have 6 or 7 different like, collaborative videos on my list that I'm like trying to balance and juggle in order to get the time in to find it to work correctly for all of us and not be too much of a bear on those people, right? Because they're being generous and giving me their time. So I have to kind of like ease back a little bit. And when my schedule is the bear, which is 90% of the time, it sucks.
So do you still work with Microsoft at the moment, or was that?
No. So I worked with Microsoft about 2 years ago.
Right.
And then I got a fantastic opportunity to work full-time for Amazon. Because most software test and quality assurance work in the United States tends to be contract. So I've been working contract for 12 or 13 years. Got an opportunity to be full-time at Amazon and remote. So I was working from home. I was still working a lot, but I was working from home, which is like, the flexibility of that was really lovely. Then Then Amazon, as you guys know, has done big waves of layoffs. I was on a pretty experimental team, and they cut that entire team. They just killed everybody in the entire division, basically. So I wasn't working there. Right now, I work for a small startup company, and I've been here for 8 months now. Yeah, but I can't talk about a lot of what I do. It's the unfortunate nature of the beast. I work. My life is an NDA. Like almost every day of my life is a non-disclosure agreement. It was even worse when I was at Microsoft because I worked on a project for a government body. Leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. There's a lot of public information. There's a lot of public information about the project I was on, but there's so many like crazy standards and things that I had to be really careful of because they basically treat it like you would have to treat the same thing, even though it's software, basically, and tech. I had to treat it like I was transporting like a nuclear missile.
Wow.
You had to treat it the same as you would like military grades weaponry. It's just like, okay, life got real crazy.
It's pretty intense. Yeah. You've just mentioned under gravel filters before.
Yeah.
Are they quite a big thing over there? Because they've essentially died out over here in New Zealand, and they are almost impossible to find brand new now.
So it's interesting because you can still easily get them, but as far as being a popular filtration method, no. Right. I think more people have converted to things like sponge filters or powered filtration, but the people who have been using them for a long time, and this is why I made a joke in my videos about it. If you're the grandpa that's still using under gravel, it's because they know why they're good, right? There are lots of positives to under gravel filtration, and if you're using them correctly, they're incredible, right? But a lot of people look at them, and there is a reasonable amount of false information out there, and I intentionally played on that in my negative video, although some people didn't get that joke. But what do you do, right? The internet, you can only control so much. But there's this concept like you need to rip the entire plate up and clean it and then put it back together, and it's like, no, that's not how you service an under gravel filter, and you rarely have to service them. So you can still get them easily. Like I can order one off of Amazon right now, and it'll be here in 2 days, right? Yep. But is it something that is getting outside of like one creator out there? It should be like Kevin Novak, which most people are pretty familiar with him talking about anoxic filtration. But he's specifically trying to do anoxic versions of the setup, not necessarily your standard aerobic under gravel system. Outside of that, like no one talks about them, right? They're just not you don't see them in popular use. But I think the more that the anoxic concept has been pushed by Kevin Novak, you've seen that like kind of a resurgence of interest. So I see questions about it like every 3 months or so. There's usually a question on a random video, like, what do you think of anoxic? And almost always my answer is, go ask the people who have the most experience with it. It's just like, if you want to know how to do the deep sand bed method, you go ask Father Fish. He's been doing it for like 50 years. You ask the guy who's been doing it forever. You don't ask the other random idiot on the internet who hasn't used it. I'm the old timer that still uses the UGF. Nice.
Yeah,
I've set one up, so
yeah, it makes total sense to go to where the knowledge is, if that makes sense, as opposed to talking to something you're not entirely sure or certain of. Talk to this person. This person will know everything that I've known, and he'll have forgotten more than what I know, sort of scenario.
Right.
It makes quite a logical sense, and that's going on. Yeah. Where are we at? Sorry, I just got lost on my list for a wee second here.
You're good, buddy. You're good.
You are an aquatic plant. I'm going to use the word guru here.
Oh, gee,
what got you
generous.
involved in aquatic plants?
So I never had aquatic plants as a kid.
Oh.
And I'd seen them and always thought they were cool. And when I was watching YouTube really early on, when I was trying to get back to my hobby, that's what appealed to me the most, was like seeing some of the aquascape tanks and living, basically creating more like ecosystems at home, as opposed to ornaments and, you know, fish and stuff like that, all the classic kind of stuff that, or like plastic plants. And I've never been good at like terrestrial gardens. So I love challenging myself, and I kind of wanted to challenge myself by trying to figure out how to keep plants in an aquarium. And I screwed up many times at first, until I started to figure out like where I was making my mistakes. And that's one of the things that keeps me interested in the hobby, is the perpetual learning that plant tanks kind of give you. Because like you can totally be like crazy plant person who's growing a new plant every other week, and you're trying to challenge yourself with the highest, the craziest tech stuff. And then you can dial back completely to the lowest maintenance stuff you can possibly do, and still learn and find interesting things about how like your fish interact with those plants versus how they would have interacted with this plant, versus just the way that like water flows differently around a bunch of stem plants versus a bunch of Java fern. Right? There's these little like nuances that you can learn if you want to. And that's the fun part for me, is getting into that. And honestly, the biggest factor was my local club that really like went me from like just casually keeping plants to going crazy about plants. Was my local club had a free plant program, and to participate, all you had to do was be doing a horticulture awards program stuff. So you had to be submitting plants and trying to grow plants for the horticulture awards program, and then you could monthly have a chance at free plants. And that was like, I like this. I like value. I like free things. Yes, sign me up. And then I went from like, maybe I'll try to grow plants in the horticulture awards program, to like, how long will it take me to be the top of the horticulture awards program? Because I'm like ludicrously competitive. So if I decide I want to compete with someone for something, even if they're not like trying to compete with me, I will go well beyond neck deep. Like I'll go so bat ass crazy. And that's been a part of my nature for a long time.
So you've mentioned your club, your aquarium society, a couple of times now. What's it called?
That's the Greater Seattle Aquarium Society, so GSAS. Okay. Really great club. They're one of the largest clubs in the United States. Not the biggest. There's a couple that definitely have us beat, like the San Francisco club is probably the second biggest, and the Missouri club, Massai, which is where Gary Lang is a member, and a number of other like really notable United States hobbyists. That's probably the biggest club in the United States. Yeah. We're somewhere in like the top 5. But our club's been around since I think it's 72, 73, long time. Okay. Longer than I've been alive. And it's had a pretty robust membership, at least for the last like decade or so, for certain. All clubs kind of go through little waves. It just depends, but our club's been very fortunate to be, since about the early 2000s, to have a pretty robust membership.
That's good. I mean, clubs are almost, a lot of countries view clubs as like the heartbeat of the entire hobby. So it's good to see that it's.
I think if you want that, like Germany is probably like the best example.
Oh yeah,
the German way that like the hobby is just done in general over there, and the love for their clubs and how ridiculously awesome their clubs are. Yeah, Germany's probably like the king.
Yeah, I mean, fish keeping is practically a religion in Germany, I think.
A lot of things are very like near religious in nature in Germany. There is a level of exception and obsession when it comes to whether it's the quality or devotion, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to anything that is a hobby in Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah, particularly here, anytime you have any fish, mainly African cichlids or plecos coming out of Germany, making their way into New Zealand, you know that what you're getting is going to be a very high standard fish, which is always nice when you hear that little tag, German import or whatever. So yeah.
So Okay, I know this is mostly an interview for me, but I have to ask: is it as strict in New Zealand as it is in Australia when it comes to importing fish?
As a general rule, yes. Pea puffers, for example, they're incredibly expensive because they can't be imported, but they are fairly cheap here because they can be. We can't get some of the plecos that they can get that are really cheap, but they're really expensive here because they're not meant to be here. So it's a very similar type situation, just different species to different allocations, if that kind of makes sense. But fish are on basically a list. You're allowed to get them or you're not. Then they go through a 6 to 8 week quarantine facility. Was there only, I think, 4 or 5 commercial ones in New Zealand, and then they get divvied out throughout the country to the retailers. I don't think, or there might be only 1 or 2 sort of small personal owned import facilities that just do little stuff for themselves and for their friends. But for the best part, it's very much a commercial point for importing fish into New Zealand.
The UK is pretty much a free-for-all. We can get almost anything because our waters are so cold that anything tropical will never survive. So, yeah, we can get snakeheads, bass, anything, crayfish, all the funny stuff that Cam can't get.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're kind of similar in that our winters are cold enough and a lot of our waters are glacier fed. But the inherent water systems in the Seattle area for the northwest of Washington are very cold, but we have some restrictions. So like crayfish and snakeheads, as an example, you absolutely cannot get those in Washington state. But the parts of the country where they can absolutely survive, they don't care, which I've always found hilarious, right? There's certain things here that they're like, nope, you can't have those. Like they would not survive in the winter.
And then there's Florida. Florida just has a crazy view on things. They've got so many invasive species.
Arguably, the vast majority of tropical fish won't survive in New Zealand because it's a similar climate. Like, it's getting cold at the moment. It's not very long till there's snow on the hills, and like it's genuinely cold. So the vast majority are not going to survive. There's obviously a concern that some will, and there is warmer parts of the country. But the real issue is that our native fish are going to get devastated from predators. Basically, that's the main concern. Even if they smash them out over the space of one summer, that's enough to ruin our conservation. And because New Zealand's so isolated, we've got it pretty good for not having intruders and pests and stuff come through. So our border controls are very tight. We're not connected to anything. Literally, you've got to fly here, a boat here. So that's why it's so strict, which is absolutely makes sense. So yeah.
I had to ask because I have some Australian fans that will all the time tell me like, oh yeah, but not in Australia, and they'll tell me some of the crazy restrictions or like how ludicrously expensive certain aquarium products are. Like my favorite light, right, the Fluval 3.0 plant light is like insanely expensive in Australia. I imagine it's pretty similar for you guys too. Where like here, it's just minorly expensive here compared to some of the cheap Chinese stuff you could get.
Yeah.
I've been on my rep to get the Fluval Light series in for nearly 3 years, and there is still no Fluval Light series here. So yeah. Wow. Were you going to say something, John?
Just when we're talking about fish imports, I always find it funny because I'll start talking about fish species and then Cam will be like, yeah, but we don't get them here. We don't get them here. And I've currently just got one aquarium at home and it's full of cherry shrimp. And, I'm proud of this colony of yellow cherry shrimp that I've got, but it's not worth even showing to Cam because they can't get shrimps. They can't even get cherry shrimps.
So really? You guys don't get neocaradinas?
Nope.
No shrimp. So saltwater shrimp are here. And there is some native shrimp, but they don't adapt to aquarium life at all very well. And that is pretty much it. No shrimp whatsoever.
That's fascinating.
They are rumored to be here. I haven't seen them myself. I don't know anyone personally that's got them, but they are rumored to be here.
Interesting. I mean, like I can't keep shrimp because I keep rainbow fish, and they just look at them as like delightful snacks.
Yeah.
So, you know, I can keep them for a week or so, and then watch my wallet cry every time I need to buy more shrimp, or I could just not keep them and call it a day.
Yeah, it's fair. Yeah, we don't have any. Fire away, John.
Just before I was going to say, just before we start getting back into the questions again, there's a question from Michelle that we could have maybe just jumped on before we got started again. But if you want to continue with what you were saying.
I didn't see that. If you want to bring that far away.
Here we go. What, in your opinion, has been the most impressive merge of technology with fish keeping products?
That's a good question. I'll kind of blanket this in that it's really kind of a fledgling thing right now, and where it can go has not been explored yet. And that's the level of like application control of things like lighting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like a lot of people will look at something like an Apex controller and some of that stuff, but those are like really big and honestly like excessively expensive solutions that probably
the Apex controller, is that when you can type in geographical locations? Or no?
I think Apex allows you to do that, but like they're designed mostly for saltwater systems where they're controlling every piece of hardware on all your timers and all this kind of nonsense. And for what it does, it's way too expensive. If you were to ask me as somebody who works in the software industry primarily, but they have a cult following who just like are willing to burn thousands of dollars at a time, and I respect to that. But like if you look at something like Aqua Illumination, Chihiros, even Fluval, all these app controlled lights, like they are on the like the fledgling level of what can be really incredible. Because where they should take this, right, is they should be partnering with scientific organizations and being able to let you pull down lighting information and try to mimic lighting information of natural habitats.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to keep Papuan rainbow fish and you want the light to mimic the natural seasonal cycle of Papua, they should be able to pull down that data and know it, because that data is widely available, and all you have to do is insert it.
We had a guest, didn't we, Cam, who had developed a prototype that does just that. You can type in any location using GPS coordinates, and it does that. It mimics the lighting, the sunrise. It actually ties in with the daily sunrise off that location live. So you're getting the exact, if you wanted to. So it is out there, and I think it's just about out of the market fairly soon.
Yeah, it will be nice if somebody does it in a way that can be adapted. The biggest problem is also that like most of your producers think very close-mindedly. They don't want to open up things like APIs. So like think about like the Aqua Illumination app or the Chihiros app or the Fluval Smart app, right? They don't want to open it up so that any user could build a secondary program that controls those lights, right? Even though the smart thing to do would be to be like, yeah, anyone can touch these. That way it's more likely to see more people adopt your hardware, because your app is not what makes you money. It's people buying your hardware, right? So what you should be doing is opening those pieces of technology up so that, you know, Jim Bob's lighting control system can control any light under the sun that is software controlled, whether it's via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or however. And all you're doing is now you can plug in a program like that where it's like, I want to have the Great Barrier Reef. I want the lighting cycle throughout the seasonal year of the Great Barrier Reef, because I'm going to build a reef tank that's mostly Great Barrier Reef, right? Or is in this part of the world, because all that data is available. And we can easily find, and putting all that data in a database is trivial in the hands of the right person, right? That would be where I want to see the fledgling of this tech go. And if we started doing that, I think we could do some really, really cool, interesting experiments when it comes to what level of the fusion of technology and home aquariums can create, right? Because I think we could do a lot more interesting things, but there's risk too, right? You start pushing crazy high levels of light in a simple aquarium, and all of a sudden algae's everywhere and and all that kind of stuff. But for those that want to go that route, that's where I want to see the tech go. That's the most promising thing I'll put out there. That is the most interesting to me as a person that works in the software space.
Yeah,
I'm thinking of benefits of that for people that like to biotope and to ridiculously mimic what they're doing, and for potentially any light cycling for spawning fish that people are struggling with that might need these little triggers from lights and circular things of suns and moons to make that work. That would be quite intense for just those two elements of it there alone, let alone anything else that goes with it.
Yeah, and if you think about it, right, is that you can start getting to a point of, okay, that's the first piece. Now, if you integrate probes like you would with an Apex controller system, and you're monitoring your water, well, you can measure things like the level of tannins in your water. And if you're trying to do the Rio Negro black water system, you could have alerts on your phone to be like, hey, you're slipping below this level of ppm of tannins in your water. You should add extra botanicals to your system. It's time to do your maintenance and add new botanicals, right? Like, there is so much that we could do to make things simple for us as hobbyists. And there are plenty of people are gonna be like, I don't want another app, and that's fine. You go old school, you do it whatever way you want. But for those of us who want that kind of stuff that makes life a little easier, especially people who like some level of automation but still want to be hands-on with our tanks, there's so much potential to build something really, really incredible. And I hope to see it.
That would be because
built in Alexa.
Well, no, not necessarily Alexa. We don't want to get into the service that listens to you at all times, whether you want it to or not. But you know, if you're just recording like simple water chemistry data, that's a little better.
You mentioned before the horticultural awards with your club. Can you?
Yeah.
I've never heard of one of them before. Can you explain how that works a little bit? I'm just trying to get my head around that from like 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, sure. It's pretty simple. So, my club and a lot of other clubs have various horticulture awards programs, and the simple part is you get a number of points or whatever. Points is the easiest way to do it to understand, based on every plant that you propagate or flower. And the more difficult plants are worth more points. So something like duckweed, not going to be worth a lot of points. It's pretty easy to propagate duckweed.
That's a shame. I can grow that.
But if you're trying to propagate something like one of the Aponogetans, where you literally have to cross pollinate flowers in order to get seed, in order to then propagate them, those are worth a lot of points, right? And then as you submit points, you just go up levels, and eventually you're going to get some kind of certificate that basically says, hey, you've achieved what we consider to be a master aquatic horticulturalist, or something along those lines. Probably the most complex, at least of the systems I've looked at so far, is the one that Missouri Aquarium Society has. So MASSI, they're actually really strict in their system. And usually they require something like having a member vouch that they've seen it, or some clubs that have really cool programs that I actually think are the best programs are you have to bring in plants and donate them to the club's auction to receive your points. So you bring in, like, if you're growing, say, like Pogostem on octopus or some simple stem, you bring in a bag of like 5 to 10 stems and you get your points. And that's their way, that because they come in, you sign in. Oh, you did that? Cool. We're going to check that off and add it to your horticulture program. Right. And it encourages, because that it proliferates the plant throughout the club. It lets more people get them relatively cheap because they're being effectively donated to the club. It helps fund the club, so the club can keep doing events and meetings and bringing in speakers and all the cool things that we want in our fish clubs. It's a wonderful, like, a cyclical way to do it. And that's the way, like, the Greater Portland Aquarium Society does it, which I think is the closest club to me that does that system. And I actually like that system a lot. But basically, in the end, it's just kind of like a sort of sanctioned, big quotation marks around that, way to basically say that, hey, you've achieved this level of mastery because you've grown X number of plants. In my club, typically to reach master, a pretty dedicated person could do it in about a year. Really crazy people can do it in like 6 months. And like absolutely insane people who are growing way too many plants for their own good will do like their first master in 3 months, and then they'll do masters 2, 3, and 4 within the next 3 months, and then and they'll go like bat as crazy. But most people, you know, at a chill pace that have like 1 or 2 tanks, or maybe they have 3 or 4, and they're only growing so many plants, they're going to achieve a master if they're really dedicated about it and like trying new plants regularly enough in somewhere between a year and a half.
It's a good way of encouraging people to kind of buy into plant care, as opposed to just seeing them as a commodity where they die, you replace them, they die, you replace them, and so on. So it's quite a good way of doing it.
And there's a lot you can learn from a horticulture program, because when your goal is to not only just have plants, but now you need to get them healthy and propagating, right? At a bare minimum, let's say you skip trying to get plants for flowering stuff and worry about that later. Just propagating plants. It means you kind of have to understand the basics of like fertilization, plant nutrition. What level of trimming can you do without killing the plant? What's the healthy way to trim a plant to where it keeps propagating over and over again, versus where can you, with certain plants, like an example that I would give that's pretty popular, Starogyn repens, right? Pretty popular carpeting plant. A lot of people love that plant. I love that plant. If you trim it back too far, you kill it. It'll just go, it will never grow new leaves, even though it has leaves at the top, like you would treat any other stem. It will go dormant and stop growing. And if you do it to enough of them, you'll kill all of them. And they'll just never continue to grow. They'll just stay in basically stasis. And you'll need, effectively speaking, brand new plants to start over to get them to grow again.
Wow. How did you discover that? Too heavily trimming, or too much heavy trimming?
Did it myself. Yeah. I got to, it was a really popular plant. So when I was going really crazy with plants for a while, I was selling a lot of plants, and I wasn't working nearly as many hours as I do nowadays. So part of my like side income, side hustle, whatever you want to call it, the way that I afforded my hobby was I just sold plants every weekend. I was constantly selling plants to people. And Starogyn repens was really popular because people would see this big, beautiful carpet of Starogyn repens in one of my big display tanks and be like, I want that. How hard is that? It's like, it's not. Medium light, no CO2, just good substrate. You'll be fine. Okay, I want some of that. And then I sold so much of it that I overly trimmed it, basically and I put all of it dormant because I too aggressively trimmed the entirety of the plant. And I noticed I was like, man, that thing's just not growing at all anymore. I used to be able to trim this thing like 2-3 times in a month, and it would just keep growing back. And now it's not growing at all. What the hell? And then I started researching. And I talked to some of my friends and some of my mentors when I was like learning the most. And they were like, oh yeah, here's what's going on. You did the dumb. It's like, all right then. So, you gotta, yeah. And that's the other thing, like Stephen P is saying in chat, if you keep them at higher light, they don't grow super tall. And then it's easier to over trim them because you'll trim them too deep because they're not growing naturally tall to begin with. You actually want them, if you're going to aggressively trim them, you want them at like medium light. So that way they grow taller and taller, and you can trim them off and leave only like a couple inches off the substrate. And usually that will keep you okay. But in higher light, you have a huge risk of over trimming it.
Cool. Well, not so much cool because obviously you don't want to over trim it. But yeah, the idea of that horticulture system sounds ridiculously cool and very rewarding for anyone who is interested and gets a little bit further into that as well, as opposed to, like John said, just buying and then dying and replacing. It's keeping them going. I think that's a fantastic option. I was trying to work out how it was like a fish keeping one, spawning fish, growing up. Could see that happening, but how the plants, and as soon as you said, reproducing them or getting them to seed or flower, of course, that's the most logical way that you're going to continue that program.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the plant version of a breeder awards program. It's just for those who have more of a green thumb than the ability to raise baby fish. It's their jam. We'd find this interesting thing in our club, because our club is pretty big, where you have a group of people who basically are just dedicated plant people. They keep fish, but they never breed them.
Yep.
And I kind of fall in that category right now, where like if I breed fish, it's completely accidental, except for my guppies, which they're guppies. It's not like I'm trying to do anything. I'm just feeding them and they do their thing. Right. And then you have people that are like super dedicated breeders, almost no plant stuff. And a great example there would be like somebody on the internet who's kind of famous because of Aquarium Co-op, Master Breeder D, right? That guy breeds so many fish and barely has any plants in his tanks ever. It's tiny amounts. He's very old school, relatively sterile tanks with just hordes of baby fish. And then there's this like rare intersection. I swear in our club, it's like maybe 5 to 10 people that really fill this out of hundreds, where they grow lots of plants and breed lots of fish. And then when you go see like their breeding setups, they're crazy because they're loaded with plants. They're creating these really awesome, basically ecosystems for these fish, but they've figured out their systems to where it's like, okay, well, that's these two species of fish breed in this. And, I've got plecos with this fish. So they're so completely separated. They can breed in harmony and they have a bunch of plants in there at the same time, which make them more comfortable and help generate microflora and all these kind of things that the baby fish can feed on. It's like these genius systems where when you see them in person, you're like, okay, balancing all this has got to be a little bit of a headache. But once it's all balanced, this is like the closest replication of knowledge. And that's
husbandry.
Isn't the aquarium hobby so fascinating that you can have with just keeping glass boxes with water, but there are so many different offshoots to it. And if you're interested in that part of it, that's awesome. If you're interested in that part of it, that's awesome. And if you want to cross, that's cool, but I don't like that, but I like that. It's so fascinating how many different facets there are just to one little tiny individual hobby. It's fantastic.
Right. And you can get that even inside of like slices of the hobby, like just freshwater.
Absolutely.
There's so much diversity in just freshwater fish keepers.
Yeah.
Right. And then saltwater is its own like insane, crazy game. Right. Because you've got the people who are like, oh, well, like I'm into just the fish, or I'm really primarily a reef keeper. And then you've got those like weird crazies in the corner who are like, I do macroalgae. Something, but you've got all these like different systems. You'll find these people, there's some people that are kind of famous where they're like, oh yeah, I literally use no equipment. I basically don't ever do water changes. I've built a proper, perfect, functioning, harmonized reef. And those people just seem like voodoo witch doctors. We're just like, I don't know how you do this, and it's, you have so much of that in salt, but you have the same like crazy, like you have people like Lucas Bretz, where it's like, yeah, I don't need filters. No, I've got hundreds of tanks without filters, and I'm doing like something completely opposite of what everyone else thinks is the you must do thing. Fish are fine. Fish are breeding. Plants growing like crazy. It's like, all right, I see you, you crazy weirdo, and I like it.
Son of a bitch.
And it's like that, and it's so mind-blowing because everyone still has the ability to learn off a totally different technique or a totally different style, and it just opens up everything every single time you talk to anybody and the differences in what they do. Cool. Can you discuss some of the challenges that you've had with aquatic plants? Obviously, you've discussed how you are trimming your ribbons a little bit too low, but any other things you've discovered or things you've kind of noticed in your plant growing journey?
Sure. I think one of the biggest struggle points is the slow learning that certain plants fixate on certain nutrients way more than you would ever expect. So the examples, and these are ones that I've learned like the hard way in many occasions, or just have happened to stumble across by talking to other people. So like Monte Carlo, super popular plant. It's a calcium hog. If you don't have good levels of calcium in your water, it will never do well. It will just die on you. There is nothing in my water. Growing Monte Carlo for me is a freaking nightmare. It takes a lot of work. And usually I cannot get it to fully carpet because of the amount of calcium it needs and how little calcium is typically in my water. And I have found that for me personally, whenever I think I've added enough like crushed coral to buffer for it, it's never enough. It's never been enough to where I'm then getting my water into a boundary of mineral hardness that the other plants I like to keep stop being as happy, right? So it's like I play this like weird game every time I've tried to grow it. Crypts in general love iron. Even the non-red ones, they need lots of iron. So you typically need to supplement iron, and for them, because they're a root feeder, you want it at their roots. So you want to have extra iron present in the substrate. Most people don't think about that. Or like Java fern, notorious for being a potassium hog. So like learning these little things where like certain plants really love a really specific mineral, right? Mm-hmm. And then other than that, and they'll exhibit weird things if they're deficient in that otherwise might not seem like that type of deficiency. You can have plants that look like they have a nitrogen deficiency, and nope, that's actually like right on the verge of too little potassium for that particular plant before it starts getting holes in its leaves, and then it would tell you, oh, that's a potassium deficiency, right? So there's little tricky hangups like that. There's also plants where like this plant literally cannot possibly grow in hard water, and like cannot possibly most of the time, like 99%. Some people can figure things out, but like Syngonanthus as an example, more commonly known as like Taninas, they're a soft water plant. Soft water with CO2, or they'll almost never grow for you. Whereas you can have, there's types of Val that are now effectively speaking native to like Tanganyika that can handle like 9 pH and don't care. Mm-hmm. Right? Where like, and you can bring them to very soft water tanks, and that particular species, even though it's the same Vallisneria, big quotation marks, as what we know as jungle val in the Americas, it will just die on you because over time it's gotten used to being in that hard water environment. Same plant, exact same species. So sometimes you'll get like people that, if they really know their stuff, they will sell high pH Vallisneria so that oh, that's the Tanganyika native version that loves hard water. Great. I'm trying to do my like cichlid tank. That's the one plant I can keep.
Yeah.
There's little like tricky things like that I think are some of the biggest. You kind of hit these like plateaus, I feel like, in plants where it's like you hit that initial learning curve, and then you kind of figure out the basics, and you can have a lot of success. But you'll struggle with certain things. And then there's kind of understanding and mastering like the where light and CO2 can matter for those that want to up their game. And then there's like all the hangups of individual plant species and how weird they can be. Because everything has something weird based on its the environment we originally harvested it from. But we've been growing them in farms immersed. And now we're trying to keep them if completely flooded in a tank, which is not how they grow in nature. They're almost never completely submerged, right? Most of our aquatic plants are usually exposed to the atmosphere at some level. Very rarely are they fully submerged 100% of the time. Yeah. So we're trying to fight them in their seasonal natures because they look pretty underwater. And there's all sorts of little tricks and hang-ups to certain plants here and there that like you just learn over time. But that's usually like the biggest, for me at least, was the biggest hurdle, slowly learning some of those things and then learning how to identify them in newer plants too. because some plants are just like certain levels of extra hard. My example would be like Ludwigia tornado. I've tried to keep this plant 4 or 5 different times. I've never had success with it. It's a super cool plant if you do it right. I can't do it right yet, but one day I will figure it out and I will get it down.
Where is it?
I love it.
Sorry, with that plant, what is it that goes wrong with that plant? Like, where are you falling short on it?
So my guesses, semi-educated guesses at this point, are it really does need higher CO2 and higher light than I tend to push in most of my tanks.
Okay.
Now I have plenty of tanks that get a reasonable amount of light. Like they'll get in summer and spring, they'll get direct through a window light, and they'll be very bright on top of having a Fluval 3.0 on top of them at full blast. And that's still not enough. But usually most of my tanks I keep at lower rates of CO2. I don't like high CO2 tanks, mostly because I keep a lot of rainbow fish. They like higher oxygen content, and they can be a little more susceptible to high CO2 rates of having health issues. So I tend to keep what I've lovingly called the American barbecue method for CO2, which is low and slow. I just keep my CO2 rates like low and easy, and I let them just roll in there throughout the time. So like an example would be about 2 bubbles per second on a 40-gallon breeder is my usual target for injected CO2. But it's just enough for like almost every plant out there until you get into like the really crazy stuff like Hygrophila chai or Ludwigia white, Ludwigia tornado, some of these like really crazy high demand plants that just realistically they don't want to be fully submerged in water. It's what the real truth is, but we can force them to if we just gas them like crazy and put them under like some kind of technologically false sun. So like a UNS Titan or something like bonkers nuts like that, and then they can look incredible in an aquarium.
No, I love the fact that pretty much every plant that you've mentioned we don't get here.
What do you get?
I'm going to loosely say, because you said cryptocrines, we get crypts, but all the rest of them we don't have here. I think we maybe have Monte Carlo here now, but yeah, basically not at all.
Do you not get Ludwigia?
Not the varieties that he was speaking about.
I mean, do you guys get
Ludwigia?
Do you get like some of the basics like Arcuata and Repins and that? Okay.
Yep.
Those are honestly those are the more fun ones anyway, because they're simple enough. It doesn't take
so our plant
care.
imports are basically identical the same as fish. We can't bring in any new plant species. About a year ago, tissue culture plants came in, which changed the game a little bit. But yeah, for the best part, we can't bring any plant species in either. So what we've got is what we've got, and we hope for the best.
Interesting.
Yeah. We had a comment up here, if I can find it again. There we go. Why is there no calcium in your water? Are you using RO water?
No. So I live in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and our water in general, at least on the western side of the state, so the more temperate side of the state, not the kind of deserty side of the state, it's all glacier water. So it's water that's run off from glaciers, and it goes into basically one of 2 major watersheds. It's either fed by one of 2 main rivers, basically throughout the Seattle area, and out of the tap, my basic city water in the middle of summer is 32 TDS tops. There's nothing in our water. There's a little bit of iron, a little bit of chlorine that gets added. And other than that, our water is very soft and a little basic. So the pH is typically somewhere between 7.2 and 7.4, but there's almost no mineral content to it. And then the height of winter, it's like 26 TDS out the top. There's just which if you're drinking it is amazing, because you get this insanely clean, wonderful water. Unlike, say, parts of Florida where your water to me tastes like broccoli runoff. No offense, Floridians, but It's just what it tastes like. I'm used to water with nothing in it. You have very mineral rich water, right? So you can do a lot with that. You can shape it and mess with it, buffer it, and add stuff to it. You can do crazy nonsense. But as a base, when you're trying to get it to absorb levels of calcium from like crushed coral, there's all sorts of other things that want to feed off of it. And when you have something that really wants high levels of calcium in it, and your water, inherently every water change that's coming in is practically RO, it can make those plants fairly difficult to keep, but not impossible. There are plenty of people that have success. I'll get there one day. I target my tanks, and this is all at this point. It's like when grandma's doing a recipe in the kitchen. It's like, okay, now you add the salt. How much, grandma? Oh, you'll know when you know. Like, what do you mean you know when you know? Right? There's no measurements. Just because I've been doing it long enough in my house with my water that when I add crushed coral, I can literally kind of go like, look at where my crushed coral is in my tank and go, oh, it's time to add about a handful. I'll go rinse a new handful off and add it in, or I'll put it in a little mesh bag that's in a filter. And that usually gets me right around like 140 to 160 TDS in my tank for general hardness. So like 4 or 5 degrees of GH. And I've just gotten used to like those small grandma style measurements that I don't test it as hard as I probably should. If I was trying to do something perfect for Monte Carlo. So when I try to do Monte Carlo again, I'll measure it. And like my current experiment with the underground filter and an anoxic system, I'm doing far more robust testing than I normally would in most of my basic systems that I set, because that's part of the experiment. It's purposeful. But if I was just setting up a random tank for fun, I just buffer the water a little bit, probably literally a mesh bag about this big in the filter. And I just keep an eye on how much is left in the bag as I do my services and reload it when I feel it's necessary.
What's your method of fertilization? Are you all in one? Are you dosing bits of whatever you need to be dosing for whatever tank, for whatever plants? Spray and walk away? How does that work for you?
My preferred method, there are some tanks that are different, but I typically use a liquid all-in-one, and I try to spread my dosing out throughout the week. So if it wants me to dose, like say on a 40-gallon breeder, 1 pump per 10 gallons, once a week for low tech, twice a week for like medium to high, I'll instead, because almost all of mine are like high density of plants, I'll basically dose like 1 pump a day. So every time I go in to feed my fish, I pick up my liquid fertilizer. I just jam it around. And I basically tries to replicate the lean dosing method with an all-in-one. There are certain tanks that I'll try certain fertilizers, and then a tank gets set aside and it only runs on that fertilizer. And I'll try all sorts of different stuff throughout a period of time to see how dosing it in different ways affects the tank. But there's like my guppy tank as an example. It's got hundreds of guppies in it, and it's like about 140 gallons. So there are several times where I just don't, in like the height of spring and summer when babies like explode in that tank, I don't actually need to dose nitrates, right? I'm producing plenty of nitrates. So I'll switch at certain times of the year to a product from Brightwell called Florin Multi, which is all my micros plus potassium, and that's it. Because the fish waste is giving me pretty much everything else I need. And I get calcium and magnesium through the natural like buffering that I do with a little bit of crushed coral in the tank.
Cool. Just a slight change of subject now. Rainbow fish. What drew you to rainbow fish? Other than them being awesome.
Yeah. So similar on the line of when I was getting back into the hobby in 2016. I found I think the first video I saw was a tour from Dustin's fish tank with Gary Lang, and it was like, I had seen some rainbow fish recently, but the only ones I had seen were like barely getting any color. So I really had never seen adults. So I saw this tour of Gary's fish room and it was just like, oh God, I need these things. I need these bad. And originally, like I now call it my retirement tank, but my first display tank, which is a 135 gallon, it's kind of an older tank that's downstairs in my parlor. I don't know. It's a weird living room, not living room, because we don't use it for a living room, but it clearly was meant to be a living room in my house when this house was built. And I was originally going to fill it with just like neon tetras and danios and that kind of stuff, because that's what I was really into as a kid. I love small schooling fish. But then I saw rainbows and I was like, big, colorful, likes plants, likes big tanks, huh? Have I got a tank for these things? So I didn't have any fish in the tank yet. I was still running through cycling it. So I started going to my local quotation marks fish store. They're not the closest store to me, but I was going to Aquarium Co-op back when they were a young fledgling store, back in the days before everybody knew who Corey was, right? And I talked to the manager at the time who was there, because that was when Corey was like really starting to grow his business quite a bit. It was really focused on the YouTube aspect. I was like, hey, how often do you guys get rainbow fish in? And it was like, oh, we bring them in every once in a while. Is there something specific you're looking for? And I was just like, well, yeah, Bozeman eye, but kind of any of them. I was like, okay. And I think something like 2 or 3 weeks later, they gave me a call, one of the employees that I talked to quite a lot there. And she was like, hey, we just had somebody who has to move, and they brought in all of their adult rainbows from their like community rainbow tank. And they're in our quarantine room, and they're going to be in quarantine for about a week. I know you've been looking for rainbows. I bet you could probably work a deal out with the store manager if you want to come check them out. And so I came down, I think like the next day, and they had something like 20 rainbow fish that were all adult size in this small for what they need, but the biggest quarantine tank they had in the room. And I was sitting there watching them. There's just a few Bozeman eye and some turquoise and a couple of this and of that and this. It was definitely a Noah's Ark style, like rainbow fish community. And just talked to the manager. I was like, okay, are these just going to sell at your like assorted rainbow price? And he's like, yeah, basically. I was like, do me a deal if I buy all of them in one shot. He was like, yeah, we can do that. And I was like, okay, what's the deal? And he was like, half price. Well, it was like, done, ring me up. It's like, do you want them to finish coming out of quarantine? I was like, no, just bag them up. I'll take them home.
Cool.
I'll quarantine them. There's no fish in that tank. They'll be fine. And so I went from no rainbow fish to this big community of rainbow fish pretty fast. And the more that I would come home, I was working for Oculus at the time. And I would just come home after going through hell traffic, because Seattle area's traffic is abysmal. I had this recliner set up in that room, and I had that tank over on this side of me on my right side. I'd just sit in my recliner and kind of turn and watch them. And within easily 20 minutes of getting home, I would like fall asleep. And my roommate at the time would like come probably an hour later and be like, hey, yeah, I got dinner done. Do you want to come eat dinner? And I'm like, yep, I'm just gonna feed the fish. I'd go have dinner, and then I'd come back and I'd sit in there in the evening and I'd just sit and watch them. And the more that I watched them, the more I was like, yeah, I think this is literally the only fish I'm gonna keep. I love these things, and I just want to learn more and more about them. And I went from I'm gonna have small schooling rainbows to I'm a dedicated rainbow fish zealot in a very, very narrow window of time, all because of about 3 videos on the internet.
Rainbows are a very incredible fish. From a retailing point of view, it's really hard to sell them because they're grey, drab, and boring. Give them 6 months, give them a year. They are such a beautiful fish.
The best example that I've seen, and unfortunately the staff member that was keeping this going at this store near me, they have a big display tank. And what they did is they would get adults of each of the species they were selling. and they put them in this big, beautiful, like Red Sea reefer that was converted into freshwater.
Mm-hmm.
So that when people would ask, what is this fish? Or they would be like, or they'd look at the other one, they'd be like, all these silverfish look the same. They'd be like, oh, come over here. And I'll let you see them as adults so you know what they're going to turn into. And then you can pick the ones you want based on what they look like as adults.
Yeah.
And like
that's really clever to do that. Really clever.
This store went from keeping like 3 or 4 species of rainbows to keeping like 30.
Nice.
They basically converted their entire saltwater section into rainbow fish. And they sell them like crazy. When they had like the rainbow fish enthusiast staff members who were really good about teaching people about them, how to keep them. And I think it's the best method I've seen for a store to sell that particular, just because rainbows are, like you said, right? They stay a gray minnow for so long, but then they hit like 9 months to a year old, and all of a sudden it's like showtime. And they're the coolest fish you're probably ever going to see, unless you're really dedicated into some of the very colorful cichlids, like you're really into Africans, you're that person who's like, I love the thing that looks like a brown potato and doesn't move for 3 weeks at a time. I was talking like ambush puffers, right? The true immovable potato. But yeah, I mean, like, there's plenty of cool plecos out there. There's lots of cool plecos.
Sorry, I'm used to getting a lot of shit from a couple of other people about being very interested in plecos, and that is very much a line that would go for a nice little jab straight after that one.
What I love about plecos is when you get them really happy, right? And they feel very safe. When the males come out after a good water change and they want to court, and all of a sudden they're like a wildly different fish than you're used to just seeing the tail out of a cave and all the females hidden everywhere else. So like I have Wabbenmooster plecos as one of mine, right? So the honeycomb ancestress. And the males, when they get to adult size, very drab. They lose a lot of that color pattern and the yellow tone until they want to court females. And then they're like neon yellow and they look insane. You can see them all the way across the room, and they'll just be out in front of their caves, full flanning all their fins as wide as possible. And they look like you had dropped a glow stick in the tank. I mean, they're just so bright and brilliant. It's incredible. And like, there's little things like that with some of the fish that people love to jab on that, like, until you've kept them long enough to see those behaviors, you can never understand and truly appreciate.
Do you think, when we're talking about rainbows, how they take a long time to color up, would you say that the exception to that rule is the dwarf neon rainbows?
Yeah, well, there's a few exceptions to the rule. You can speed that process up, but a lot of the dwarf fish tend to grow quite a bit faster. They also have shorter lifespans. Yes. So like a praecox typically is going to live more in that like 3 to 5 year range, where like a bozeman is going to get you 8 to 10 years if you take really good care of it, right? You know, so yes, there are exceptions. There's also like the opposite. So my best example would be like the running river rainbow fish from Australia, right? My favorite of all the rainbows because of its story. They're a small fish. They're really only like 3.5 inches. They take way longer to color up.
Interesting.
But when they do color up and they're happy, they're so wild because like their bodies are gold. They have bright red fins. They have these huge black stripes all over the place. And what's more important and cool about them that's different than a lot of the other rainbow fish, they're incredibly tight schoolers. They school like rummy-nosed tetras.
Cool.
Where like most rainbows have a very distributed shoaling, right? Not running rivers. Running rivers will wire up together like any of the small, like hyper good schooling tetras, like your emperors and your rummy-nosed tetras. So if you were to give them a really big water system with a good group of running rivers, you will see behavior you will not see in any other rainbow fish. And it's so cool to watch. They're so fun to watch because their behavior is way different than a lot of the other rainbows out there. And when they do fully color up, they're so wild because they exhibit a lot of those beautiful, like multicolored things that you get primarily in Australian rainbow fish. But they're small, so you're not dealing with like goiter rivers that get enormous or something like that. And unlike those other big fish, you don't see them fight as often. You don't see them spar as often. You see them in these really close-knit family groups where they stay very close together. So you can have 5 in a tank, or you could have 40 in a tank, and they'll be in these hyper tight schools the entire time. It's
Did you find that they have like
awesome
an
to
alpha?
watch. Oh yeah, absolutely. You absolutely have 1 or 2 males that are usually the most colorful and largest in body size. But you don't see them. Some of the other rainbow fish species, they will pick on the smaller males a lot, and they're not like hurting them, but they're letting them know, like, get out of here. You're not spawning anytime soon. You don't see that behavior with running rivers. They act more like guardians, where they'll be the ones that are up front, and the rest of the school sits behind them if you're near the glass. It's really cool to watch.
Cool. Sounds very, very cool to watch. Unfortunately, another species we don't have here, but that's okay. Bosmani rainbow fish.
Mhm.
How many different variants or catch points are there of that fish?
So, fun part, they're discovering new ones.
Cool.
Right now, you have the Ayamaru, which is the classic, the one that's been in the hobby the longest. Then you do have almost all of them come from some portion of the Ayamaru lakes, which is the biggest part. But there are some that are in like the stream systems. So you have like the Abe's Creek and the Chromsa are both stream fish. They tend to grow even slower than the standard Bozeman. So a lot of people, and I only if she were going to be here, she'd bust my chops if I were to say otherwise. But like Kelly Foreman, who's a big rainbow fish fan and beloved member of our fish family, a lot of us will say like, oh, they typically stop at about 3 inches. They get to about 3 inches, and then their growth just like halts and goes really, really slow. But they will eventually get to like that 4.5 inch size. They get big and chunky like some of the others. Then you have like the Atinjo, which is probably the most popular. And they're, unfortunately, in the United States, they have this bad problem of calling them the red Bozeman instead of calling them by their actual catch point, which is, that's part of the industry trying to be simple and easy, right? But it hurts some of the hobbyists in the long term, because realistically, there's big differences in the coloration if you keep the catch point separated. Then you have, come on, brain. Uter, U-T-E-R. Uter is like a subset of the Atinjo, basically speaking, that gets, instead of like, so Ayamarus are like a brighter yellowish orange and very bright blue, most common. Atinjo are a much more reddish orange, very deep orange with a very dark blue front. Uters are almost full red in the back, and their blue is so dark it looks black. And then the Aves Creek is really cool because they have that good brighter blue front, but then they have a gradation from yellow to that deep reddish orange that goes down the body as it hits their orange portions to the back half. Whereas Chromsa are a very deep orange and kind of a halfway point between the bright and almost black levels of blue, where it's obviously a blue, but it is very dark, closer to like a navy color when they're full color on the males. There is another catch location, I can't remember, that's pretty recently coming into the hobby. That's another stream fish that is supposed to be the smallest of all of them. Quotation marks. And really what that means is we haven't seen them grow to full size yet. We just know that they've hit the point where they've slowed their growing a lot. And they're going to grow very, very slow from there on out, unless they're in probably a really big water system and fed crazy heavy. But they seem to almost find, every time Gary goes out, they seem to almost find a new species of fish, and every couple of trips they find a new Bozeman of some form. Wow. Because there's all these small water systems, just because of the way that Papua New Guinea and Papua are formed, where it isolates portions of the species, and over time they've evolved small changes in their coloration, but their genetics are, effectively speaking, the same. They look like a Bozeman. But there's some small, whether it's dietary or whatever it is, where there's small alterations in how their coloration is exhibited or their size and things like this. Because like the Ayamaru, a proper Ayamaru can get 5.5 inches. They can get big, big for a rainbow fish, right? And then like the Chromsas, I think the biggest ones that we know of in captivity are only 3.5 inches for full adult males. And those males are like 8 years old in Germany.
Wow.
But there's almost none of them in the United States. Getting a Chromsa in the United States is like impossible. They're only in Europe. So John, I need you to get me some Chromsas.
Okay.
Just go hassle those crazy Germans. You'll find them.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a guy, he's retired from the hobby now, but Alex, his name was, I can't remember. He used to do a lot of work with rainbow fish, and he was renowned in the UK for like the man for rainbow fish. So
he's probably be in the same circles as like Johannes Graf or Wim, some of the big German and Dutch guys that are really well known for rainbows. They have a really tight knit circle out there, and getting into that circle is kind of a bear. But once you're in, you're in.
I remember he used to share pictures on my old Facebook group, microscope shots for the eggs and fry and stuff like that. So it was really interesting.
Oh yeah, rainbow fish eggs are like a very fascinating thing.
I know.
And also at the same time, such a pain in the butt because they have no yolk sac when they hatch. They're incredibly fragile. They're teeny tiny.
Yeah,
they take for damn ever to grow. But it is a magical time watching.
Have you got any general care requirements that can help people that are interested in rainbow fish and really getting them to explode and to thrive?
So there's like 3 biggest pieces of advice I would give anybody that wants to try rainbows. Number 1, you need a big tank. And by that I mean like realistically the ideal tank size is going to be either like a 55 gallon or a 75 gallon. If you're keeping the number of fish you're keeping and you keep the right species, aka you can't keep the biggest of the big, you can do a 40-gallon breeder with a small group. That's possible. But realistically, you want a 4-foot or larger tank. They really want swim space. And so with that being said, like you also have to keep in mind if you go and plant that tank to leave mid to upper water swim space for them. Because if you really oversaturate that tank with plants and you reduce their swim space, they will run into health issues because they won't be happy. They're a very active fish. With that, they also need high oxygenation because they're a very active fish. And most of them are used to stream and river environments where they have higher oxygen saturation. Not all of them, but most of them are used to higher levels of oxygen. So add an air stone. Help yourself out. Right? Make sure you have good gas exchange. From there, the biggest other things that you really want to pay attention to, temperature. They're tropical, but they don't want to be super hot. So you can keep them at 80 Fahrenheit, which is like 27 Celsius? Too old to do the conversion in my head anymore.
Yep, that's one that Celsius to Fahrenheit, I never every time.
but realistically, what I would say is like 74 to 76 is usually the best target for almost every rainbow fish out there, which is basically like 24 degrees Celsius, roughly speaking. 24 to 25, you're going to be fine in that range. Thank you, Brian Marshall. 26.67 degrees Celsius. But basically, if you stay in that like 24 to 25 Celsius, maybe up towards of a 26, you should be fine. But realistically, like if you're using Fahrenheit, if you're one of those weirdos from the US like me, 74 to 76 is your target. You can go a little hotter, you can go a little cooler, but you don't usually want to do that for a prolonged period of time. And with that, like I said, temperature, swim space, oxygen. In general, the other thing that just matters is clean water. Rainbow fish really do well if you keep your parameters in check and clean. They love few things a rainbow fish loves more than a nice 50% water change every week. Like rainbows really benefit very heavily from weekly water changes. And if you are trying to do less raw water changes because you have some kind of limitation on the amount of water you can use or whatever, maybe you're only doing with buckets, so it's really hard to change that 125 gallon 50% every week, right? Then use plants to help yourself there so that you're keeping relatively clean water where you're not having like high nitrates, or especially ammonia and nitrite. You definitely don't want that at all, but keeping all your parameters nice and clean so you have good clean water for your fish. That's one of the big things for rainbows. And beyond that, just let them do their thing. They eat really healthily. Don't put them with fish that are super shy, because those fish will never eat. The rainbows will eat everything. You could feed them 5 times a day and they would still act like they've never been fed. They have little bottomless piggy stomachs, but just don't feed them that much because they will practically kill themselves. They're that dumb. And the last thing, rainbows jump. Rainbows, as Gary likes to say, rainbows bump and rainbows jump. So if you can, darken the back of your tank and even the sides. Dark substrate, that's going to help get the best color showing, and also prevent them from being idiots and ramming into the glass and like banging up their noses all the time. And then have lids, because they're dumb. They will try to fly out of the water to get the food you're feeding them. And then you've got to go chase a rainbow. I just saw my wife in chat. I'll tell you this story. We were feeding the fish, and my wife went in to look right before we were going to leave for the day. We were going to see some friends. And all of a sudden I hear this noise, and my wife like kind of lets out a little scream. She's like, "Honey, one of the fish jumped out of the tank." Because I'd left the lid open after I fed them like an idiot, because I was in too much of a rush. And I just was like, "Okay, put it back in the tank." She's like, "What?" I'm like, "Just pick it up with your hands and put it back in the tank." She's like, So I had to like run around the corner and come over to the tank because I was around the hall, and I literally just scooped up the fish in my hands and went blunk, closed the lid. Like, "He'll be fine. Just put him back in the water." She's like, "I'm sorry, I panicked." I'm like, "It's okay, honey. Thank you for letting me know the dumb fish jumped out of the tank." And I had one fish 3 days in a row fly out like a missile. What's that? I was gonna say, I've had one fish like 3 days in a row.
After the first couple of times you find fish in the ground.
Yeah. It's one of those things where you're good. It's one of those things where I think I know where you're going. Is like you make that mistake a couple of times, and then you're like, "I'm getting a lid on this thing because I'm not losing another one." Right? I've had some fish, literally the same fish, the same male, missile out of a tank 3 days in a row while I was waiting for a lid to show up off of Amazon. Because for some reason, this fish that had grown up in this tank and had been in there for like 6 months, just for 1 week, was, for some reason, I don't even know why, was really skitchy and skittish. And now never had a problem with him ever since. Could probably go to not having that lid. Fish would probably be fine. I haven't seen him panic, run all over the tank ever again. And I don't know what spooked him. I have no clue. But I've seen him fly past my face 2 out of 3 days in a row trying to feed him. And I was just like, "Yep, okay, put feed, move over to this tank." Son of a... Come back over here, you idiot. Like flying halfway across the room.
I set up a small, I thought it was a fluval edge years ago, and I got some nice Moscow black guppies, and it was a really simplistic, minimalistic tank. I thought it was really cool. And they'd done nothing but jump out that water. Don't know why. I've never had guppies do that, but they just jumped. I've seen every single one of them jump, and none of them died. They didn't do it when I wasn't there. I wasn't losing any. They were just, I don't know what was going on, like a puppy when you come home from work.
Your Moscows have the same problem that a bala shark when I was in college had. So the last tank I had in college, we had a Jack Dempsey cichlid in it, because this is my cousin worked at a Petco, and he wanted to keep big angry cichlids, but not too big. He didn't want to go like dove eyes, so he wanted a Jack Dempsey. And he'd got some bala sharks. He's like, "Oh, these grow fast and they get big. They'll probably be safe." Only one got allowed to survive with the Dempsey, because the Dempsey was a real mean fish for its early life. But then the one that lived was its like best friend. And any fish that ever tried to mess with that bala shark would get beat the heck up by the Dempsey and put in the corner, which is kind of hilarious to watch. This bala shark, because we were too poor to afford a lid on our 55-gallon bow front that we had. This bala shark, whenever you would walk past the tank, and we kept the water low after we learned this, would try to jump at you.
Wow.
Because it wanted your attention. So that this bala shark had like suicide leaped out of this tank onto a slate floor for months at a time, almost every time someone walked past, especially if you hadn't fed the tank that day yet. If you had fed the tank, a little less likely to happen, but if you hadn't fed the tank quite yet, it's more likely to jump out. So we started keeping the water level lower to try and prevent this fish from jumping out. Never would do it when no one was around. We could leave on the weekend. We could be gone across the state to see family. Never had a problem. Only when you walked past the tank, and it knew it was either me or my cousin, and those are the only two people that fish would jump on.
Wow.
So weird. So weird.
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me of when you come home from work and you've got a dog, and you know it's a young dog, and they come running at you, and very similar to that.
Yeah. One sec. I just heard my headset scream at me like, almost out of power. Gotta get my cable and plug it in.
Cool, no worries. I'll do the standard blurb. If you're enjoying this, please like, share, follow, blah, blah, blah. Right, we're back. Cool. Awesome, fantastic. Feeding requirements, rainbow fish. What do you find to be the best option for food for them to get coloration out of them the best?
Well, I mean, if you really want the best food, live. You would feed them a lot of live. You'd feed them like Daphnia and maybe brine shrimp. They actually do really well on frozen foods too. So like Cyclops, you can do bloodworms, but they're not super nutritious, but they love them. It's like giving I would give it to a kid of like giving a beef jerky stick to like a human being or a dog, right? It's not the perfect nutrition, but it is decent enough. I would say if you're not trying to go that level of expense and or caretaking with like live fish feed cultures, a good high quality flake that has high protein is going to do well. So like in the United States, I use the Extreme Community Crave, which is a mix of their spirulina and their krill. Yeah, it's basically a 50-50 mix. The one thing I will say is you do want a reasonable amount of vegetable matter in their diet because they can have constipation issues if you give them too high of protein, and kind of not quite as bad as like the Malawi bloat, right, which is far more dreaded. But you will notice a difference when like your rainbow fish are a little constipated. They don't get quite as bloated. They're at least like slightly better at that part, but they eat a lot of like insect larvae and stuff like that in the wild. So in general, they like a reasonable amount of protein, but they do eat a lot of excess whatever the heck they can find. They are very omnivorous. So giving them some level of vegetable matter to help just kind of push stuff through. And in general, I like 1 day of fasting a week. I've just noticed for my rainbows, especially in the summer, it's kind of like, excuse you. Yeah, you're barking at the rest of the household that are outside washing rocks for their tanks. My wife and my brother-in-law are washing rocks for their aquascapes they're putting together, and my dog is barking at them. Hey, come on, quit barking. No. You're gonna get in trouble, Missy. We'll see how long she.
Was your brother-in-law Cheba Faith? Is that
no, that's my wife.
Oh, is that your wife? Okay.
Yeah. But they're probably listening to the stream on her phone while they're out there. But yeah, no, my brother-in-law, his brother-in-law James, but his I can't remember what his YouTube name is because I don't think he's ever watched any of the streams. But he's been in some of my videos and he does like some live game streaming too.
Cool.
You were saying rainbow fish are very aggressive eaters, and to be cautious of tank mates that may not be quite as aggressive. What are some ideal tank mates to roll with rainbow fish if you're wanting to build a rainbow fish community or a community tank around rainbow fish?
Sure. I found Corridoras and loaches in general can both do well. Just make sure that you have food that makes it down to the bottom for those fish. So like the trick that I always do is I'll put in flake food at the top of the tank on one side of the tank, and then I'll throw in my sinking wafers on the other side of the tank, because all the rainbows will run over here and they'll all go crazy and do the rainbow fish feeding dance, and then they'll completely ignore the rest of the tank. And that food can get down to the bottom, and they're dumb enough to not figure it out unless they literally watch the thing sink, and then they'll chase it and try to eat it constantly because they're too dumb to realize it doesn't fit in their mouth, and they can't really chew it up that easily. Rainbows are not smart. For those who've never kept them, they're very dumb fish, but that's part of the allure and beauty of them is they're not the brightest in the world, and it can be very fun to watch them be really stupid. But other than that, there's a lot of like maintenance type fish that they do well. So you can keep them with some of like the bigger tetras, like Congo tetras, and even like emperor tetras do really well. Some of those tetras that are get like 2.5 inches or so. It's some of your fish that are more shy that you want to watch out for. Cause like I've kept them with white clouds, with cherry barbs, with tetras, with danios, but like some of the smaller danios. So like the leopard danio will do fine, but like the gold ring danio, the smaller version of that, those tend to struggle because they're a little shyer. You wouldn't want to keep them with like celestial pearl danios as an example, because they're more shy fish. Some gouramis can actually struggle. Some of the smaller ones, the big boys won't care. They might freak the rainbows out when they're like reaching out with their feelers, going like, "Hey, what are you?" Right? And that I've watched a number of rainbow fish when I used to adopt fish freak out when my big like gold spot gourami was like, "What are you?" And they're like, "What is that?" Right? You just watch this rainbow like swim, because they're not used to certain things just reaching out and touching them. They're not bright, but it's fun to watch. But like basically anything that is going to be shy to food or wait for food. So like ambush predators, not good to live with rainbow fish. Some of your like more demanding plecos, so like a hypancistris, like a zebra pleco, leopard frog pleco, I would not keep those with rainbows. I would keep those in their own tanks or with fish that aren't like really aggressive eaters. And I don't use aggressive in the sense that they'll like attack other fish. I mean that they're so boisterous when they get to their food that slower, more relaxed fish would be like, yeah, I'm not going over there right now. Right? Because rainbows like really do turn into torpedoes when food is in the tank. And they're so fast, they dart all over the place. It's fun to watch. They're crazy. But other fish that are a little more chill are going to be like, yeah, I'm just not going to eat right now. But they'll do that every day, every feeding, because rainbows will eat every time you put food in the tank. So, find fish that are not scared. Like angelfish can do well, right? Angelfish can do well. Plecos can do fine. All your like different algae eating fish, like I keep autosynclus in almost every tank I have. They do fine. Don't keep shrimp with rainbows. Rainbows will eat them, but snails are just fine. It's things like that. There's little lessons over time you'll learn. The biggest one is usually shrimp no with rainbows, unless it's pseudomagills, then you're fine.
Yeah.
But those aren't really rainbow fish, let's be honest.
Have you had any challenges when it comes to breeding rainbows, or anything specific that people should know if you're looking at getting into spawning them and producing them?
Rainbows will spawn every day when they're happy and healthy. They are vigorous members of the fish society. They love them some action, and they are also not going to discriminate. They will breed with any other rainbow fish, whether it is of the same species, the same genus, that doesn't matter. I have watched Melanitanias try to court Chalatherina females and Glossolepis females, and vice versa, males, they don't care. They will hybridize surprisingly easily. So don't do that, because rainbows actually get ugly when they hybridize. It is really rare for a hybrid rainbow to look good. So if you want an ugly brown fish out of your really pretty rainbows, let them hybridize. Otherwise, try to keep them separated. Where the trouble comes is that they produce very small eggs. They have no husbandry whatsoever, in the sense of they will not protect their eggs or their fry at all. They will eat them. You can literally watch parents throw eggs in the water and turn around and start eating them. They're that dumb. They don't realize, they're just like, that looks tasty.
Pretty good.
To be fair, it probably is quite tasty.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, caviar. What do you do? But usually, you get a really dense breeding mop. They'll throw eggs into that pretty regularly, or some fish can do really well with mosses and certain plants. I've got a friend who breeds a lot of his rainbow fish with Cypress helferi. He just has like really dense bushes of Cypress helferi, and he'll uproot an entire bush of it and move it to a different tank, and then just have armies of babies show up in a couple of weeks. And that's his method with a couple of his species that he keeps. But here's the fun part, or the not fun part. When they hatch, they have no yolk sac, which means they need to be fed almost immediately. And when they hatch, they're these itty bitty little pencil streaks. And they don't do well in flow. So they need relatively still water, minimal turbulence in the water for at least the first month. And typically, we try not to put any reasonable flow on a tank until they're 3 months plus. And they will live only in the top inch of the water, with some exceptions. Some species are a little different, but this is like 95% of your rainbows will live in the top inch of water for the first 3 months of their life. So any food that sinks below that, they'll never eat. And they need excessively small food for the first 2 to 3 weeks of their life. And they hatch at different rates. So you could have a big horde of eggs thrown on a mop over the course of a week. And anywhere between 7 and 21 days for each individual egg is when they'll hatch. So you'll have these differentiations in when they're hatching. Now, most of them, a majority of the eggs are going to hatch within 2 to 3 days of each other. Mm-hmm. When you have stable parameters in your tanks. That part is relatively easy. But they need between 5 to 50 microns is the size of food they need for the first 2 weeks of their life at a minimum. So that's smaller than baby brine shrimp. Freshly hatched live baby brine are too big for baby rainbow fish. So you need something like ceramicron, golden pearls, vinegar eels, micro worms, any of these excessively small, whether they're live or powdered foods, to feed them for the first few weeks. And then you can get to like live baby brine and things like that, which is like the most optimal food for baby rainbows, because when it's moving around the water system, they can chase it more, and it's more likely to stay in their feeding zone, or encourage them to get outside of that zone and explore the rest of the tank, which is one of the big ones. And that's how you can get them to stop living in that top inch of water, is some of your live foods.
I wasn't aware that they had such a variant in hatch time per egg. What do you think causes that, or why that is?
So I haven't dug that deep into that part. I just have taken the advice from almost every rainbow fish super nerd I know, which is, like at this point, I'm very fortunate to like be on a close conversational basis with folks like Gary Lang, where I like have his phone number and can call him if I really need to. But most of the time we communicate via email. Like a lot of the big names that are in the US, I'm lucky enough to have been enough of a screaming internet idiot that they know of me and like me enough to want to communicate with me directly. But there's just something in the way that rainbow fish are. They have a relatively hard shell on their egg once it sets up within the first 24 hours. And it's just a matter of time of that fish getting effectively strong enough to break that shell. One of the other things that should be noted is rainbow fish eggs fungus really easily. So in general, there's a couple of ways that we fight that. Number one is keeping water flow, fresh water flow on the eggs helps a lot. But then remember, as soon as they hatch, they're not very good in flow. So like there's this weird, careful balance that you can find ways to keep, or kind of the cheater method is having them in a container where you can have the akin of like a single drop of methylene blue to about 1 liter of water is enough to usually prevent the fungus from happening on the eggs. But just know that like fungus will spread egg to egg. So if they're really close to each other or they're not spread out or something and they touch, one funguses and the other doesn't, they're both going to get fungused.
Yeah.
You know, things like that. And I think that's one of the hard ones for, I've noticed, especially a lot of like folks in the Northwest where I live who try to do rainbows. The biggest hurdle for you to overcome to get to hatching rainbows the first time is preventing fungus. And then once you've figured out the way to prevent fungus in your systems, then it's okay. Now you've got to get most of the fry to survive for the first month. And then after that, they become relatively bulletproof. They're really hardy fish once they get past that like first month of life. Most rainbows are fairly hardy outside of like the devil incarnate, which is mycobacteria or fish TB, as we more commonly know it.
Yeah, I've found that to be relatively true there. Once they're past that stage, they are pretty easy growing. They just take so long to grow from this big to this big. But yeah, once they're through that initial hatch month, yeah, you're normally good to go for them as far as no die-offs and that kind of stuff goes.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the best parts, or maybe the most rewarding parts about being a rainbow fish keeper.
Yeah. Got a little bit of lag going on again. That's all right. We'll just change tact again just a little bit. Working on things like your reviews and all that sort of stuff. You mentioned earlier you really want to give things a decent period of time before you come out and say what you feel about them and all that sort of stuff. How do you approach what you do and just ensure that people are getting a proper hobbyist review as opposed to, used it for 3 days, it's great, move on sort of scenario?
Sure. Good question, because it's different item to item, right? Like I treat a filter differently than I treat a light. I definitely pay attention to things slightly differently. So, like as an example, if you're doing a heater, right? Certain heaters do really well in low flow, other ones do not. So, what's the first thing I'm going to test on any given heater? Different flow rates. I'll screw with the position of my filters. I'll completely remove a filter and put it onto just a sponge, and I'll move that sponge all over a tank or some other air-driven filtration to mess with a heater. Because there's plenty of them that are like, it's not enough flow, I'm going to freak out. Some of the more technically interesting, so like the Fluval, was it E-Series? The ones that are in like the plastic box inside them, right? They're phenomenal heaters if you have good flow around them. If you don't have good flow, like you're running a sponge filter, probably the worst heater you could put in your tank. Just because they're so finicky if they don't have good flow. But when they have good flow, they're rock solid. Where like a filter, testing a heater is pretty easy. Just make sure, like, okay, well, if the rest of the room around me is at this temperature, or like if my heater is got my water at 78 degrees and I suddenly drop it down to like 72, how often do I see it turn on? If I'm paying attention to that, like if I know the water is 78 for at least like 6 hours after I make that change, if I keep an eye on it and I'm looking over there regularly over the course of a day, and I'll see it turn on a bunch, well, then I know that the temperature sensor in that thing actually isn't that accurate, right? It's heating the water way more than it needs to.
Yeah.
There's little things like that you can do that are simple, where like a filter is more about abusing it, right? You want to make sure that it doesn't clog up super fast with higher bioloads. So if I'm testing a filter I haven't played with before, one of the first things I'll do is overfeed a tank like crazy. Because that way you're just getting a bunch more Muln buildup in its mechanical filtration. And how does the flow happen? I'll be less. This sounds almost abusive to my fish, but I will intentionally let evaporation happen faster. I'll remove lids off of tanks when I'm testing filters to cause higher levels of evaporation. Because like the best example, one of my favorite filters is the Seachem Tidal. I like it for a number of reasons, but I also hate it because it's so reliant on the dam skimmer that it has built in. 90% of the work is done through the skimmer portion, and once that starts getting low, it's loud, its flow goes just all over the place. It causes all sorts of problems. It's really easy for that portion to get clogged up if you have like a hair algae outbreak. That causes all sorts of problems. You'll get snails that get stuck in it all the time. There's little things like this that you're not going to know if you test it for 3 days. Yeah. But if you put it on a tank for 3 months and you let like the nature of what a lot of fish keepers can often do, which is like, hey man, I'm just too busy at work. I can't do my maintenance on this filter as often as I'd like to. What happens if I leave this filter and I don't maintain it for 2 months? Like, is the sponge coarse enough to handle that, or is it just going to go to hell? Is it going to be like an AquaClear where I just watch the tray inside the filter slowly raise up and lift the lid off the top of the thing? Like little things like this that you can observe over time with, I hate to say it this way, but intentional abuse of the tank.
Yeah.
And this is definitely like the software tester side of me that goes like, okay, how do I break this? What angle of attack can I take that will intentionally cause the system to be on the verge or completely fail?
Well, I mean, if you're testing a product and people want to know what it's capable of doing, the best way to do that is to push every situation to the extreme.
Right, exactly. And that's a lot of what I like to do. Whereas like lighting, right? Lighting, I'm looking for, how flexible is it? What happens when I put it on a Wi-Fi timer and it's just suddenly having its power turned off and on within some level of interval? Some lights that I've done testing on that like never saw a video for, an example would be I've literally unplugged the light for 3 months. And you're going to be like, how the hell does that test it? Let me explain. So I've done a fair amount of hardware testing as well. And one of the tests that you do in long-term hardware testing is trying to test how well and how resilient the capacitors are on any given circuit board. Because cheap capacitors, when they aren't given power for a long period of time and then suddenly are given power again, will fail on you. So if you remove power from a device for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and then you suddenly give it power again and make it run full tilt, you leave it on full blast, you never turn it off for 2-3 weeks straight, the capacitors can blow out and the whole thing can fail.
Wow.
There was a prototype light that I was sent from a company that happened to, and I'd unplugged it for a month, and I remember they were like, "Hey, what are your thoughts on this thing?" I was like, "Oh, I'm not done testing it." Like, yeah, well, what are you doing? Well, right now it's actually has no power and hasn't had power for 3 weeks. They're like, what? Huh? I'm like, I need you to trust me on this. Okay. And I like a month later, they checked back in. I was like, oh yeah, so I actually just powered it back on, and one of the capacitors blew. Like, what do you mean one of the capacitors blew? It's like the light just died after it got power back. It's like, your vendor is giving you too cheap of parts on the internal control boards, and one of the capacitors blew. They're like, how do you know this? I'm like, well, I worked in hardware testing. I've tested motherboards and all sorts of different microcomputers, and this is one of the things we do. I don't have a voltage meter, so I can't like play really crazy games with the power on it. I don't want to bring home a like $5,000 piece of hardware from my job, because they'll ask all sorts of questions if I do that. But this is like the like lowbrow cheap way for me to do similar testing. And there's stuff like that you can, if you want to go really crazy to test the quality of a piece of equipment, you could do those things. Is it necessary? Absolutely not. But there's going to be that occasion where somebody like has to move, doesn't set up their fish tank right away. The world gets in front of them. They're working a bunch, and they're like, "Oh, but I want to dig out that old light. It worked perfectly fine before."
Yeah,
that's a user scenario.
Practical scenario,
right? And there's weird stuff like that you can do, or just like testing it at different light intervals. An example would be a prototype. I'm far enough past my NDA now. I can talk about it. One of the early prototypes of the aquarium co-op light, if you put it down to under 20%, while you were dialing the dimmer down, when it had a rotatable dimmer switch on it, it would flicker at a specific spot every time. Every time you got to about like 14, 15%, it would just turn off and back on for a second at one of the percentage points. And it was just something they didn't notice because they typically were never bringing the light that low of power. So there's all sorts of like weird things you can do. Most of the lights nowadays are like pretty bulletproof, or they're so limited that it's hard to like break them in those ways. But there's always something, right? Some lights do not handle, like the Fluval is a great example, right? If it loses power for 15 seconds, it forgets what time of day it is. Yep. So it'll turn back on and go to its program, but it assumes it's midnight and starts at midnight. So you can't use it in conjunction with a Wi-Fi timer, as an example. Yeah, so if you lose power,
I had an Interpet light with a Bluetooth controller that did the same thing. If it lost power, you had to reset the app and reconnect it all. If everything stayed powered, it was fine. But if you lost power, it would reset everything.
Yeah, and that's the scarier scenario, right? Is it even forgets what its light settings were at.
Yeah.
The Fluvals at least like remember that part. They're good about that. They keep that in a more permanent memory. But effectively speaking, like for those who are computer nerds, their hard disk memory or their storage remembers the settings. But for understanding the time of day, that's kept in RAM. That's kept in dynamic memory. So when it loses power, it purges. Right? So its permanent memory remembers, oh, I've got this setting and I'm programmed to this. But the time of day to trigger all of those settings is kept in dynamic memory and get purged the second it loses power, effectively speaking. Wow. So there's you could do all sorts of crazy stuff. Now you could combine the app if you're clever enough and understand those things with a Wi-Fi timer, do some like really weird, crazy nonsense that you can't do in the app naturally. But do you really need that? Probably not. But it's good to know.
Is there reviews that don't make to the light of YouTube, or do you review it and they all kind of go out into the world? How does that work for you?
There's only one that has not made it out. And that was like a prototype thing that I technically wouldn't have reviewed in the first place because it was a prototype. But they had said like, oh, well, if you really like the prototype, we'd love you to like advertise for us. And it had a couple of, I'll consider them catastrophic failures. In that just from a user perspective, I felt like they were nothing I basically could not say anything positive about it. Wow. I gave the company a bunch of feedback. And they were like, okay, thank you. And I think they never really contacted me again. I think they reformulated whatever their product was, which really means they sourced a different line out of a Chinese company, because that's really what it was. It was just a source Chinese light that I didn't have to take super long to find it on like Alibaba or AliExpress. I think one of the two. Almost everything that I get from a company, if I accept it nowadays, I basically reject almost everything, just because I don't have the time or space to try like every random, and most of them are just knockoff cheap Chinese products. And it's just like, I don't want to advertise these to people. I don't want to put them out on the internet because they're cheap, terrible products. I would much rather see actual innovation happen, rather than just like whatever knockoff product that this Chinese manufacturer has sold to like 15 different people, but you're the one that gets to sell it in the United States. You know, it's like, sure you are. And I'm sure Higer will totally not have that same light in another month, or some other company that has an unrecognizable name that no one's heard of will have it in another month. You know, there's a lot of stuff that gets rejected. But early when I did a lot more of that stuff, I never rejected anything wholesale, unless it totally didn't have to do with fish. Like there's tons of companies that will, and I'm sure you probably even get these emails where they're like, we'd love you to try out this product. And it's like your invisible fence for your dog. And it's like, I'm a fish channel. I have dogs, but I don't, what? You know, or like I saw one that was like, an auxiliary light for your car. It's like, okay, random spammer of YouTube channels. You totally found the right demographic into my fish channel for your light that goes in a car. Right. But as far as like more dedicated fish products, there's only one that's like that I was doing some test work on and never made a video because it was just so, in my opinion, so bad that it wasn't even worth discussing. Even to rant about how terrible it was, because it was still considered a prototype. And I think this company basically just got free R&D out of me is what it really comes down to.
Yeah. Has partnering with brands affected the content that you produce? Obviously, you just said you're not pretty much at all back now, but prior to that, you know, is there things that they make you or insist that you have to do, or how's that kind of wiggle for you?
Sure. So I specifically don't take sponsorships. So anything that would require me, I have very strict rules. Basically, I have to be able to say whatever the hell I want. You do not get to see it before the public does, and I get to test it however I want. And if you do not accept those three things, I won't work with you. I've been kind of lucky to work with a couple of bigger companies on certain things. Like as an example, while I'm not sponsored by Extreme sends me every product they have in testing when it comes to their foods, if it applies to freshwater. Cool. If it's meant for saltwater, they don't send it to me. But if it's meant for freshwater fish, they send everything that they're testing to me in every stage of their testing. And the only reason why is basically I give them really detailed feedback. And an example of this would be they have a sowfly flake, which is a black fly larva flake that came out relatively recently. Yep. But for like a year and a half of its testing, before it even got remotely close to the public, I had 4 different versions of it. I had it in a pellet, in a granule, in a flake, and you know, most of the people that they have in their small network of trusted people that they send test products to would give them really small feedback. I would send pages of feedback. And like one of the emails I sent to the owners was basically like, okay, so I tried the Planex straight up for this amount of time, and here's what I like, here's what I don't like. And that's like 3 or 4 paragraphs of positives and negatives. And then it's like, okay, here's every custom blend I tried to see how it affects the rate at which my fish eat the food. And here's the differences I noted. Wow. And those are 3 and 4 paragraphs a piece. And I would build, because they send me a bunch of food just because they love when I give them feedback. So they just constantly hurl food at me, which I love because it means I don't have to pay to buy fish food. Yeah. Unless it's frozen food. I buy frozen food regularly because I love feeding frozen to my fish. So I guess I'm like pseudo sponsored, but not really, because I try all sorts of other stuff all the time anyway. And I will send them all sorts of stuff where it's like, okay, so I mixed it with this product. Even though you said you were going to reject this part of this product, it had this one thing that I liked. So I mixed it together with this, and I did this X, Y, and Z at this ratio. And here's what I saw. Right? And like it's levels of probably unnecessary insanity, but that is just the way that I operate. And they love that because I give them probably an unnecessary level of feedback. And there's been a couple times where they've been like, well, what if we tried to do X, Y, and Z and change the formula? And I'm like, I'm one person of feedback. Don't prescribe to me like I'm a biochemist or something. I'm just one level of feedback. Take my feedback with a handful of salt like you would anything else, but mix it with all the others. And if everybody is telling you this thing is a problem, then it's a problem we need to look for. Yeah. But if I'm the only one bitching about it, then I'm probably just being extra ticky-tacky because it's the nature of who I am. You know, details matter excessively to me because that's my industry by nature, is the details, right? So I'm probably looking at stuff that like no one else is going to care about. But maybe, just maybe, it'll matter.
Well, the thing is, it's important because at the end of the day, you're a hobbyist, and the hobbyist is their market. And if a hobbyist says this isn't doing what I require it to do, and it falls on deaf ears, then their product isn't going to go too much further, if that makes sense. So, as a company, if I was getting screeds and screeds of this information, okay, cool. So this is fantastic. We can work through this, as opposed to, yep, that was really good. I like it. Let's, can I have some more type of scenario? So.
Yeah, and I think that's like I said, why Extreme's a rare case, and why they like me a lot. It's just because I provide ludicrous amounts of feedback for effectively no money, because they just send me a box of fish food every so often, and in the grand scheme of things, I'm sure that doesn't cost them a whole ton. But
no,
I love their company because they are so willing to listen to feedback that I'll happily basically provide them free labor by playing around and testing stuff in my tanks. And giving them information, because I feel like it's my ability to have some level of impact toward a product that's in the hobby. Because most companies, like, I could give them all the feedback in the world and they'd be like, "That's great,
yeah, thank you."
Thank you. I think the only one that's been even close to that is Flu Ball, and only because I gave them a lot of feedback specifically on their app. And they were like, "Yeah, well, if we do get to a point of where we can update it, we'll keep this in mind," because it's pretty clearly made by a third-party contract company, and I'm sure they were like, "Build it once, major update. Okay, probably not going to spend that much money on it again unless we do another big revision of a light." But I gave them similar levels of feedback, where when they reached out to me at one point, the guy who's kind of in charge of some of their outreach, he's a phenomenal guy. He's actually the guy who's on most of their YouTube videos. He was like, "Hey, so just so you know, we really love the guides that you made on our light. Can we just send you a light as a thank you? Because when we get questions about how to operate the light, we just send them links to your videos now." I was like, this is right when the Aquasky 2 was coming out. I was like, well, if I can get an Aquasky, actually, because it's a light I haven't tested yet, I'd love an Aquasky. And then I can test it and make videos on it. And they were like, yeah, we'll send you an Aquasky. Yeah. Sure.
Win-win. Yeah.
So, it's one of those things where it's that's, I think, one of the bigger flatteries I've had in the hobby is this company is yeah, we literally just send them your tutorial videos when they ask questions. And then if they have more questions after that, then our customer service tries to help them.
We've had a wee question from Rochelle. So Extreme Foods has only really just recently hit the New Zealand market within, I think it was earlier this year. Nice. So what is your favorite of the Extreme products?
Sure. So there is bias in what I'm about to say, in that I love flake. I love flake because it's really easy for me to grind up in my fingers so that I can easily feed all sorts of different sides, whether it's guppy fry, rainbow fish, whatever I'm trying to feed. So I have a bias toward, I tend to prefer flake over granules. With that in mind, the Community Crave is my favorite product. I use it constantly. It's my staple food. I love the sinking wafers, which they've had a couple of different names over time, but basically the ones that are designed for plecos and corridoras, the standard sinking wafers. I love those things. They're really great. I like feeding them to a lot of my ancestress and my corridoras and some of my tanks. Beyond that, I like the nano granule. It's just because it's so small, it's really good for rainbows. There's a big bias, right? I'm a big rainbow fish keeper. Rainbows are idiots with throats smaller than their mouths. So I basically have to have smaller foods in general, just to make sure that my rainbows aren't dumb and choke themselves to death. So with that, you'll notice some of the biases. Yeah, if you don't know that, rainbows are dumb and can choke themselves to death. Yeah.
Didn't know that.
Sometimes it's more prevalent in the chalatherides. I've noticed over time, because they tend to have the kind of longer, bigger mouths in their face, and they have smaller throats. All the rainbows, their mouths are actually technically bigger than their throats. So usually that's why you'll see a lot of rainbows spit out their food and reconsume it, spit it and reconsume it. They're shrinking it down. but they can, if you have a granule that's too big, choke themselves. So out of paranoia mostly, because usually I'm feeding food way smaller than should ever be a problem, I stick to flake because I can grind it up really small, and they are really good at finding small granules of food even in a full adult size. Weird personal preferences. But those are kind of my three go-tos. The other thing that I do like, it doesn't have as fast attack rate. I don't know a better way to put this. The rainbows don't jump on it as fast as they do the krill, but the SoFly flake that they've put out is really good. And I like mixing it. I know it's difficult for them as a company to do like some of the custom blends that I make, but I make a basically like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 blend that is 1/3 SoFly, 1/3 krill, 1/3 spirulina. So it's kind of what I call the upgraded community crave. They have other stuff that they're testing that I don't think is released yet, that I don't think I can talk about yet. But similarly, I love it for similar blends. I'd have to check. It's been a while. They might actually have it out. Let me go to Extreme's website real fast.
I've tried the community crave, which I quite liked the 50/50 of the krill and I'm going to say spirulina, but I can't remember if it is.
And the new wrigglers, the kind of fake bloodworms, so to speak. That's actually a really great product.
Yeah,
that's the other one I forgot.
Yeah,
have they released this yet?
If they have released it there, I can almost assure you it's probably not here anyway.
Okay, good. They have released it. They have a beef heart flake.
Oh, wow.
And it's so the other blend that I did, that this was my favorite blend until I ran out of my last test batch of it, is 1/3 beef heart, 1/3 SoFly, 1/3 krill. Okay. Then that's the protein mix that makes up 50% and then 50% spirulina. So it's like this real crazy blend that I built. I really liked it because it worked really well. The only downside is that my water would be cloudy for about an hour after feeding with that particular blend. Which like Extreme kind of, because of the nature of how they build their stuff, it has less binders and stuff in it. It is a little more notorious for clouding your water for a little bit after feeding, but that goes away relatively fast. This one, I just noticed the clouding was a little more significant, but the fish would go bat-ass crazy for that blend. And I would usually see really good color after feeding that for like 3 weeks. So it's just like random notes of stuff that I tested where that happened to be like the best blend in my tests of food when I was testing a bunch of stuff before it released.
So when you're doing tests, do you kind of log them, or is it just all stored mentally? Like, do you have a process?
It's all in my brain.
Yeah.
it's all observations in my brain. The one thing I will note is if I see a pattern multiple days in a row, I write it down. And it's all in a big OneNote document that's on my computer. Okay. And then usually after I've sent all that feedback, I purge it. Because basically once it's sent, I kind of purge it so that I'm not flooding my OneNote with too much stuff. And it's just a personal upkeep habit. It's like cleaning out old files out of your computer, right? I just try to keep my notes kind of clean so I don't have 8 million pages I have to file through to get to whatever the most recent thing is. But yeah, it's a lot of it stores in my head. I'm kind of lucky that I have really good memory and I'm really good at observing patterns, which is kind of the nature of my job, is observing patterns and trying to break things. But so it's one of those things where when I see something 2-3 days in a row, I log it. And if I only see it once or twice, I keep it in mind until I see it again. And then I start looking for, then I'll kind of like put a mental note and look for frequency. And usually it's in most cases, it's been rare for me to see something where it's like, okay, this happened once and then it happened again. And it doesn't happen in some like regular cadence. So like, as an example, one of the blends I did was too protein rich. And I noticed that like the stools out of certain species of fish in my fish room, they would have the super long, never let it go poo, way too long. But it was only in 2 species of fish. It was only in some of my guppies and 1 species of rainbow. Affected no other fish in the fish room with that same blend. So it's like little things like that that are like weird patterns that I can notice that just they log into my brain super well. So rarely do I have notes unless I need really meticulous stuff. So like as an example, the anoxic system that I'm working toward, that's going to all be logged in a journal because those are numbers and I'm not going to remember that perfectly, right? But like little pattern things like that when I'm testing like food, especially, that's all up in the noodle. It's pretty good at storing all that stuff pretty well. But when it starts failing, I'll start turning it into physical notes instead because, you know, as we get older, the brain only works so well.
Oh, it does.
I've personally noticed a lot of change in fish food for the positive in the last probably 2 or 3 years or so. A lot seems to be, there's a lot more range that is specifically targeting geographic reasons of fish. There's a lot more insect-based foods coming through. Do you think, obviously the community crave is a blend, do you think there'll be potentially more of these blends coming through to hit the more community with a bit of insect, with a bit of algae, with a bit of krill, for example, to try and hit that? Or do you think that blend is just going to be too hard to hit the masses for the majority of fish keepers?
I think it's going to depend. I think when you get companies like Extreme that are more willing to experiment, that's good. And there's similar things with like there's companies like Ken's Fish that make food in the United States that are some of the smaller companies that, like, compared to say like New Life Spectrum or some of the big boys out there, right? They're more willing to experiment and try different things. Now, a lot of it's sourced, right? A lot of it's sourced from some manufacturer in China or something like that, right? But they're more willing to experiment and try things. And I think those companies are the ones that are going to latch on to things if the market demands it. So if you start seeing more people go like, you know what, I want more sustainable food sources, then you're going to see way more insect-driven foods. Like that's part of the reason why Fluval went really hard on the bug bites, is because black soldier fly larva is extremely sustainable and a very good source of insect-based protein, right? So that's why we're seeing like other companies like Extreme and some of the other ones out there start to create black soldier fly larva-based foods because they're seeing the success of one company trying something. You're also gonna have like the old souls out there. New Life Spectrum is kind of like this, where they don't care what you say. They think that they make the greatest, most best thing in the world, and they refuse to listen to you otherwise. And those are the companies that I think are going to over time fail, because they're so stubborn that they'll wait until the very last second to realize that they're making a massive mistake, when they could very easily leverage all these like zoologists and different places that they're working with on professional scales, on top of like bigger hobbyists that are really big in this hobby, whether they're, you know, semi-professional breeders or even full-on breeding operations that use their foods that could easily be like, what would you change about this? How would you optimize it on more than just price? If we could find a different way to optimize this food, what are the negatives you see? Or just looking at even like the blends that some of the farms use. You'll have small farms that, like, you know, that's how Extreme started, right? They were their own food for their fish farm. They were just making their own food. And eventually they started making a product they made available to customers because it worked so well on their farms. And now they don't even have a fish farm really anymore, except for testing their own products internally, because they're a fish food company now. You know, it's like there's going to be companies that do that kind of stuff eventually. And some of the smaller companies will work with other farms and they'll do cool stuff. And we'll start seeing things. Well, like I think the small companies are more interested in talking to some of your scientists that are doing interesting experiments, especially like when you start looking at gut loads and things like that of fish in the wild, and might be more willing to try and replicate foods that create those. Whereas like I could never see Tetra doing that. I could never see like some of your big boys that have been there, or the people that are just like clearly just there to make the cheapest thing possibly, Wardley, to ever take that level of step to actually care about the hobby and the fish that are eating their products.
JBL do. They're a company, German-based, obviously. I don't know if you get them, but they do a lot of field experiments, and they share it all on their website.
The only products that we ever see from JBL, and it's basically like 3 retailers in the US, are their kits for testing.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen any of their other products here, but I like them as a company. I think they're a really cool
I've done a lot
company.
of testing, but I've done a lot of reviewing for them years ago, and I was getting boxes and boxes of all the different fish food, and they sold this Arctic krill, but it came in sachets, and it was a wet food in water with, obviously it wasn't alive, but it was as good as alive, and you just ripped the lid off and just poured it straight in.
Did you have to refrigerate it?
For it? Krill, yeah, Arctic krill.
But after you opened it, did you have to refrigerate it?
No, it was only one portion.
Okay, so it's singular portioned.
Yeah, interesting. It was probably about that size.
Interesting. So it's kind of, that's cool.
Yeah,
I wish stuff like that existed in the United States. Honestly, I think I'm the closest.
That straight from the Arctic, they said, which I thought was really cool.
Very cool. Yeah, see, like that's the kind of stuff that I think
Tetra is similar.
Mm-hmm.
Does Tetra do something like that?
Yeah, I think it used to be called Tetra del Silicio or something along those lines. And 4 different. It was a mixture of a little bit of a gel, small little tube. Rip it open, pour it in. It's been discontinued here in New Zealand, but I used to think it was a fairly good product. It was like a wet version of a frozen food that wasn't cold, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's very similar.
Yeah, I mean, like I can't see anything like that in the States, but I'd be more interested in foods like that. Like when you start seeing foods that are made of different proteins than the usual, like just generic fish meal or whatever. I mean, some places are making higher quality off of their ingredients, right? Where like they're using whole fish fillets instead of a fish meal, and they're being more specific about the parts of the fish they're using, or the specific fish they're using, instead of just like generically fish meal. It's like, oh, we're using salmon fillet and this fillet and that, right? But I'll be interested to see really long term, the closer we can get to making things that are closer and closer to live, as far as like what their actual nutrition they provide, or things like the I'm trying to remember Hikari's name for it, fiber bites, right? Which is like the wigglers for extreme, where they, because of the nature of how they're designed and how they float, they kind of mimic like frozen bloodworms in a way. And so like the more that I think companies can find ways to sort of mimic pseudo live or frozen foods with high nutritional value, that'll be interesting. Like some of the companies out there that actively use probiotics in their food systems, and are using the type of probiotics that can live through the process, because some say they're using probiotics, but the type they're using like doesn't even really live through all the heat processing that they have to do.
Yeah.
So there's that.
People that add the probiotics after it's been through that side of it.
Right.
Yeah,
right. And that's interesting kind of stuff. Is like, I think the more research that comes out where we get that kind of understanding of like gut biomes and things like that of some of the fish that are in nature that can influence food producers. And then it's just a question of who's willing to actually go that route and put it out economically friendly enough for hobbyists to care, and not like, oh yeah, well, we made the most amazing food ever. Oh, but by the way, like a little, 15-ounce tin is going to cost you $45. Like, thanks, New Life Spectrum. Totally what I needed.
Yeah.
Overpriced food.
Quite good. That was one of those ones. It was made of the fruit based. There was a lot of study from the wild went into making that, and that's quite good. I don't know if you've heard that one.
No, I think that would be good for. There's a number of like South American fish that would be good for. Probably be terrible for rainbow fish, but because they get a lot of their gut biome is mostly insect based, but so they kind of need like higher live protein of some form, but the fiber contents, like kind of vegetable-ish matter, would be helpful from fruit forms.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our structured questions that I have for you. You've done well. We've gone way longer than I thought we were going to get, so that's cool.
Yeah, I haven't had any fires show up, so that's the good news.
Nice. Cool. Okay, so that brings us into our school of six. So it's just 6 very short questions, totally off topic to everything we've just talked about. So the first question is, do you drink tea or coffee?
No coffee. I just don't like the bitter taste that coffee is. I like tea when it's cold, and especially if I feel sick.
Interesting.
And my preferences tend to be. Oh, okay. I'll leave the details out.
My internet's doing dumb stuff again.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Doing a coin toss, are you heads or tails?
Tails.
Never fails.
Cool.
That's right.
Tails, never fails. Paper, scissors, rocks. What's your first call?
Avalanche.
Oh, that's not an option.
Yes, it is. You don't know what an avalanche technique is?
No.
An avalanche technique is your first 3 calls are all rock.
Okay.
If you could have a meal, if you could have a meal with anyone alive, dead, fictional, from any point in time, who might that be?
Oh my. That's an interesting question. I don't know that I've ever thought about this particular question. The person that I think would be the most fun to sit down with living would be Steve Wozniak. Who of former Apple fame, but like he's a big hardware engineer, so it would be fun to be able to pick his brain. Dead. I think it would be immensely entertaining to sit down for a meal with Freddie Mercury.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of stories.
Awesome. Yep. Are we alive in the universe? Are we alone in the universe?
No.
Cool. And what is your unicorn fish, whether to keep it, breed it, see it in the wild, take a photograph of? What's one fish that you just need to have in your life at some point, somewhere in time?
This is a good one. Inherently, I want to go with a rainbow fish, but I know that's wrong. Because my unicorn fish is a strange scenario, because it requires like some really nonsensical things, which is to say an extremely large water system. Okay. I would want a cross river puffer.
Ooh,
cool. I've never heard of them, but I'm assuming ginormous if you need a big water system.
Yeah, so cross river is like the cousin to the Mabu puffer. So they're a very large freshwater puffer that come out of the Congo. They come from an even harder to get to area that has way more war-torn issues. They're the ones that have like the red spots all over their body. And they get 2 feet or so.
Wow, good size fish.
Yeah, so you need a very large water system for them, especially if you wanted to keep multiple, which would be the real goal, is to like see a group of them living in harmony, right?
Yeah. And the last thing that we've got is, where can people find you if they want to find your content or catch up with what you're doing?
I'm extremely unoriginal. I'm literally under just my actual name, Bentley Pascoe, on YouTube. I used to do some stuff on Instagram. I've kind of chilled out on doing that because I'm pissed at Instagram as a platform in general. But yeah, primarily just YouTube. So I do a weekly live stream as of right now. That could change, depends on work. And I always do at least one video every Saturday. But again, like a weekly video. Usually I try to have 2 pieces of content between live stream and a video every week.
Cool. Oh, thank you very much for your time, It's been much appreciated. Very excited that we got nearly 2.5 hours through, thinking we might have been able to only schedule for an hour. So that's really fantastic. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been a blast, guys.
It's a really good pleasure.
Awesome. Oh, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed bringing it to you. Have a good one, team. Happy fish keeping, and catch you later.
Stay awesome,
Thank you,
everybody.
guys.